So, Janice, let's jump into talking about resilience in leadership. Resilience, I think, is a watchword for the last 18 months. One of the things that we were talking about before technology got a hold of us, and I want to rewind, is this concept of both and institutions. One of the things you write about in when we are living in a liminal season, you call it, which is a time where we are on a bridge from one thing to another. You write a lot in your article about this push-pull that we live in as institutions, also as leaders of those institutions. We are in a time where we're experiencing loss and new birth at the same time. We are living in survival and perhaps even preservation, but we are also addressing change and innovation at the same time. Right. And in the midst of this, you talk about thresholds. Similar, I think, to Malcolm Gladwell's tipping points, that leaders must recognize thresholds in this sort of chaotic time where we're between what was and what is yet to be. Talk to us some more about thresholds and this liminal season.
So let me say a quick word about why that I wrote the article about resilience just quickly, and then I'll say a definition of resilience, because thresholds are directly related to that definition. So the reason for putting the article together is that over the last 6 years, as far as TMF is concerned, I mean, I've been, along with the rest of our leadership staff, working directly with clergy. And one of the things that we have heard in the last 12 months that we had never heard before is just it's the level of weariness, frustration, anxiety, just sort of bone rattling kind of fatigue. And it's no wonder, I mean, we could talk about that, but we began to think about, given all that pastors are going through, what does resilience look like? What does it mean? And how do we live in this time? It's liminal space, but liminal means that one thing is ended, but you haven't gotten to the next thing yet. To use your image, it's a bridge time, but it's also a time of such uncertainty. You don't know where to put your foot to take the next step. And that's pretty anxiety producing for everyone. So in thinking about resilience, there are lots of definitions floating around out there. But the one from ecology, which was put together, which was created about 15 years ago by a couple of Australian ecologists, we talk about resilience as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance, like we're in major disturbance, and to reorganize so that it retains the integrity of its core purpose, even though the circumstances may have changed. So that's the kind of operating definition of resilience, and can say a little bit more about that later. But threshold, the question that Carrie's asking, is directly related to this, because what happens when a system, there is so much change that a system can no longer reorganize around its original core purpose. It, quote, crosses a threshold. And you're right, it's similar to Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point. You cross a threshold, and the system changes from one reality to another reality. For example, if we were thinking about it ecologically, that's one of the pieces about climate change. It is, if it happens in a big way, I mean, there are thresholds we might cross that we can't return to what things were. It would just be an example from ecology. In terms of a church, that can happen in a number of ways. It gets so small, it finally closes. or it consolidates with another church. But there's all this resource that is built up through the years, and then that's when leaders need to think about what else is possible. I mean, what is an entirely new system that maybe honors the very most center part of the core, but moves on. So a church facility, depending on the facility, it becomes instead a green space for children to play in, or for a community garden, or it becomes a nonprofit that houses. It becomes low income housing. So it has changed dramatically. A threshold was crossed, but there's imagination, there's clarity of purpose, there's ingenuity, and something new is created. That's what I mean by crossing a threshold.
I think
one of the things we want to do, and I think you want to do in the event of a conference like this, is you want to build capacity for resilience. You want to help people increase their own capacity and to help them increase the capacity of others for resilience. And that's part of what we're talking about today.
So let's talk a little bit about purpose then. So a key part of your definition of resilience is retaining one's purpose.
Yes.
You write a lot about clarity of purpose. There are a couple of things I wrote because I love the way you said it, is that we are moving from what we most preserve to what God is calling us to do. So during times of disruption, what is most required of leaders in order to do that, to find this place where they understand what it is to preserve, to find that purpose, but also be equally open to innovation and change?
That's one of the most challenging and exciting parts of resilience. It's both. It's holding on the one hand the sense of we're no longer going to try to hang on to everything we've got, and yet on the other hand, where is God calling us now? Where is God leading us? And so we want to be thinking about purpose and maybe asking questions about purpose that we hadn't always asked before. So, for example, for many of us, we use the language of purpose in a pretty individualistic way, either personally, what's my purpose? And we use that language. What is God, what is my vocation? Now, maybe the question for a Sunday school class is, what is our vocation? Where is God calling us? How would we define what we're in service to? I think for many of us, and I'm speaking of Methodists here, but you all can think about if it works for Episcopalians too, the sense of purpose was something pretty safe and secure. It had more to do with continuity than it did with change. And so what happens now is that it's not so safe and secure. And in fact, it is risky to take a step in a new direction. So it's beginning to tease out some of the pieces of purpose. I grew up for many years thinking about, I chose my purpose. I mean, that was something I did. And it was a very wise pastor who said to me, sometimes purpose chooses you. And that is that we are living in a different time, a different space right now than we did even 5 years ago. And frankly, even 13 months ago. I mean, our purpose as congregations may have shifted, not in its most essential function, not in its core of cores, but in terms of how we gather. How we work together. So purpose is in part shaped by context as well as by something that's inside of us where we sense God's leadership.
That's really interesting. And, I worked with congregations and nonprofits for a long time on their purpose or mission. And one of the things that I found most challenging, really, for leaders was to accept the fact that the core essential purpose really doesn't change, but how we live or maybe manifest or demonstrate that purpose changes with the context, as you just said. I think context for one's purpose is critical. And we're living in a time where change is happening at such rapid speed. And also, I think what's so challenging about these last few months is so much of the change is coming uninvited.
Right.
And in fact, I would say a lot of it unwelcome. And so it's requiring a whole different kind of resilience. I think we used to talk about resilience as, maybe a leader being able to design change to make sure that your organization doesn't become static. But now what we're talking about is resilience in the face of uninvited change.
Right.
And all of the change, I think it's important for everyone listening today to know that we are not only talking about a pandemic and what that's done to us. Much of this happened or started before the pandemic and will continue beyond it. External changes that are not invited, sometimes not welcome, and that are coming at us really quickly. So how has that shifted the maybe the definition of resilience, or I would even say the role of innovation and creativity when the change sort of happens first, and instead of us designing a change and then we move into it, the change has come and we have to address it creatively. What are you observing amongst leaders in the church in addressing this kind of period?
Well, one of the things we're observing for sure, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, is how challenging this is. And I mean, if we just think back in the last 12, 13 months, it was like we were all ready to do our regular Easter Lent. We were, almost through Lent. And then, we hit the first and trying to close things down. That meant that for most, Palm Sunday, Easter, if you were going to have anything, it was going to be virtual. And we all thought it was just going to be for maybe a couple of months. And we acted that. So if we just take that as a starting point and think about so pastors pivoted. I mean, people that didn't know how to use it, turn a computer on, learned how to get on Facebook and really try to begin to offer and move faith and be able to communicate in some different ways. So all of that has just added up on top of it over and over. The other change, I think, that we are aware of that's been so challenging is, and this was going on a long time, it moved exponentially during the pandemic. And that is the shift from together, which was the 1950s and 60s, and when lots of our churches were built. I don't know about yours, but we had a time of togetherness to a time of individuality, my preference, my ideas. So and in the pandemic, that has just accelerated to the nth degree. Christian faith, community of faith, just by its name, community, we are a communal people. So how do we, in the midst of all this, begin to help? The context is now a highly individualistic context. How do we begin to reimagine and move toward community together? And is it going to be just to try to return to what was, which I would say is not going to be helpful in the long run? Or what does it mean to engage the community outside the walls of the church? There's lots of data out there which indicates that even when we can come back, everybody together, that the attendance in churches that are doing that is about 36, 37% of what it was pre-pandemic. Now, many people, and I'm one of them, that thinks it'll get a little better than that because people are scared to go. But we need to ask ourselves, is God saying to us, hey, you guys have been inside your building way too long. So time for you to get out and meet your neighbors. Time for you to think about, imagine, is your purpose larger than the community that lies inside those walls on Sunday morning?
Are you seeing any interesting or innovative examples of congregations addressing that shift?
Yes, we're seeing some experimentation, some creativity. One of the most simple and it's just been delightful to watch has been this congregation in Texas. They're in a city that really was in lockdown. Their mayor said, no, we don't want you to have worship or to be with more than 10. And after about 2 months of that, they said they wanted and started talking about what would it be like if we could have Holy Communion again in some kind of normal way. And what they did, they created what they called front yard communion. And again, 10 was the limit. And so they picked some families that were willing to put a card table up in their front yard. Pastors from the church came, and I think they offered. They expected just their church members, but when it was happening out in the front yard, at that time it was still very nice outside. And so neighbors came and said, what are you doing? And then neighbors began to take communion, and that began, so there, that just kind of grew and grew. And then somebody said, we've got a lot of food insecurity here. Would it be all right if the host, could we bring canned goods to put on your front step that all of us together would take? I mean, it's still going on. It's still a simple thing, but people met their neighbors met neighbors. And it was just a discovery of a kind of a different space. And I don't know what it'll be like. Will any of those people walk into a church once they're fully open again? I don't know. But I think the front yard communion piece has been there a while. We've got some other ones out there too, but maybe I'll save those for another question here.
Well, you've got me thinking a lot about innovation that happens in a time of disruption. And I think what's going to be interesting to see is how many places are looking at that as a temporary measure to deal with an unwelcome time, and how many will morph that into something that's brand new.
Right.
And I think one of the things that takes creativity, energy, and also courage, because that kind of change is always going to meet resistance. We know change comes with resistance.
Right.
So courage is something that you also write about. And I wonder if you talk to us a little bit about courage in the context of resilience and leading in a time of disturbance.
In a way, it's always required courage to be a pastor. It's just that now we're in a situation where I think even more courage is required because the time has got so much angst in it, and people in a time of distress want to pull back in, be focused on taking care of the center. Rather than engaging. We've got, such the distrust in the culture of anything institutional, including the church, is really problematic inside the church. I mean, it's happening outside, but it's also happening in. And it's also true that what once, at least once were ordinary conversations about, when school should open, how we treat one another in a pandemic, things like racial equity, poverty, those are now seen as political. And so they don't want to have a conversation about that even in their Sunday school class. For us to be the people that God called us to be, it's going to take more, the kind of courage to step toward those hard conversations and conversations that other people will feel as uncomfortable. We're really seeing this, as I assume you are, around conversations regarding racial equity, racial justice. It's like, okay, right after George Floyd, it was okay to have one or two conversations. But now, we've pulled back from that because we feel like it's too political. And another just quick example is the whole issue around wearing a mask in church. I mean, how quickly that became politicized. And I don't know about Episcopalians, but I can tell you that in Methodist, there were some big hits to pastors who said, we are going to have in-person church, but we're going to practice social distancing and everybody's got to wear a mask. And that was, it took courage for those pastors to stand up and kind of hold their own here. We need, and those, we need the support, the courage for risk-taking and innovation in a time such as this. I'll stop there.
Well, one of the things when you were talking about courage and risk-taking, I believe in your article you alluded to Brene Brown, who talks so much about vulnerability.
Right.
And that's another sort of push-pull kind of tension in this time of leadership. Talk to us, and I think we'd love to hear some more examples of what you're seeing in congregations, but talk to us a little more about this sort of this need to be vulnerable, although some of it is not even a need, we just feel vulnerable, to be innovative, also to inspire confidence in those you are leading. What kind of examples are you seeing out there of pastors who are doing this well? But also by contrast, what are some examples, you don't obviously have to name any places, but some places where you think maybe they haven't hit the mark on this? But I think all of us are looking for examples of how people are moving out of this time. And we are right in the middle of the tornado. It's not even like it's settled yet.
Right.
And we're trying to figure out what leadership looks like and what the world is going to look like after, and what people in the congregation are going to require. What does gathering even mean? So talk to us a bit about vulnerability, courage, and innovation, and what you're seeing out there in the church.
So one of the things that we've discovered in our conversation with pastors is the importance of narrative that opens up our own vulnerabilities, so that in sharing those with others, even digitally, which is what almost everybody around us is doing, that we are strengthened, not just by our own telling, but by the community helping us to be strengthened. So we had a church in an area not far from where I am. This was about maybe 3 months into the pandemic. So we're getting into early summer and then beyond. And they were trying to think of, how do we help people and their families? These are kids. Remember, kids weren't in school. You had people trying to work from home with their kids trying to work from school online. The stress level was out the top. And so one of the pastors on that staff began to think about, we have people in our congregations who've been through some really hard times, some maybe even tougher times than this. What if we pulled together some wilderness stories? And so they created a small group, again, where we were, it has to be smaller than 10. And so there was a small in-person group to help, but mostly it was all digital. And because she was a good pastor, she knew her congregation, she could help choose some members of the congregation that had lived through great difficulties before. And this is in a city, so and there's a military base there, so they had everybody from people who had PTSD and had to try to move through that, to all kinds of illnesses, to bankruptcies, divorce. People by that time were losing their jobs. All those. So there was a lot of, they called them wilderness stories. And there was a lot of wilderness example, but there was also in the telling, so she invited people to one at a time in that small group, all filmed, digital, anybody could tune in. That's pretty vulnerable to tell about your, divorce and recovery to anybody tunes in. And then what helped them? What did they learn going through this? Obviously, they have come out in a better place. That went on and on and on. And I think it ended up being 12 or 13 weeks. And they created a library of wilderness and resilience stories that you can go on their website and listen in. I mean, to me, it was a great example of pastoral care, not only for the folks who were there, but for the people who were listening in, and a way to build capacity for resilience. Again, the focus here is how do we, from my perspective, how do we build my perspective, my capacity, your capacity, the congregation's capacity? How do we build capacity for resilience? So that would be, now I know, there's some congregations that have really just kind of pulled in on themselves. And you probably have those as well as we do. And this is going to be hard to come back in those situations. And I'll just add this little piece to it. That's why I think hope is so important. And it's so important, because otherwise people just quit. I mean, they just give up. And so on the one hand, you need a sense of reality. So real hopefulness is not based in something that's pie in the sky, but rather it is based in reality, but it's also based in a deep reservoir of spirit that God will be present, is present in whatever happens here. And we work together. I mean, Walter Brueggemann, he talks about that as orientation, disorientation, reorientation. So if you want to go to the Psalms, that's really important to us as well.
Yeah, you call those oscillating narratives in the article, and I love that term. And there is something powerful about crafting a story that is neither all good news nor all bad news. And I think that's what you mean by wilderness story as well. But I loved that term, oscillating narratives.
Right. So just quickly, so 3 kinds of narratives. For those of you who are listening, one is an ascending narrative. That is to say, I came to this country as an immigrant with nothing, and look at me now. Here I am. And we have those stories of the good times of our lives. I'm married. This is my 50th wedding anniversary. That's an ascending narrative. A descending narrative is how, what has happened once upon a time. I was president of the bank, and now I don't have a penny to my name. That's a descending narrative. And Carrie, what you're talking about, and I think is the most resilient, is when in your family or in your church, you can tell a story that oscillates. Sometimes it ascends, sometimes it descends, but always it's being made new. That's really healthy churches, especially those that are more than 20 or 30 years old. They can tell you those stories, and whatever comes to them, they can say, well, I remember when. And to be supported and undergirded by saying, God made a way, or the Spirit made a way, or Jesus made a way.
What is the power of an oscillating narrative to the listener? Why are they important?
It's because we can move. We don't expect life to be ascending all the time, and nobody's life is ascending all the time. This life, everybody's life, if they live long enough, has moments of hardship, adversity, suffering, sorrow. Everybody's life, and so it's learning to know, it's learning that God can use that to create something new. Paul talking about groaning as if in childbirth, the new creation, that it's about something new can be born from that suffering. And that's very much a part. People who are leadership scholars, they talk about the importance of adversity, suffering, even personally in the work of resilience. Todd Bolsinger talks about that. He's got a new book out called Tempered Resilience. Remember, he's the guy that wrote Canoeing the Mountains. Lots of people know him. It's a brand new book right out. We interviewed him on our podcast. And he spends most of the book talking about how it's the hardship, adversity that strengthens us for resilience in the future. It tempers, to use his image, it tempers us. We think that's true as well.
And that's tempered. His new book is Tempered
Resilience.
Tempered Resilience.
It came out right at the end of 2020.
That's a great title. Title.
Right.
So in the article that you wrote, you sort of wrap up hope, purpose, and courage as the characteristics, I suppose you could say, of resilient leadership. Do you want to pull that all together for us? And then I think what we might do is invite everybody to go into groups and explore this a little more.
So I to come back really to where we started, I think we live in a liminal season. It's a time of tremendous uncertainty. It's a time of great possibilities, but also great loss. And frankly, I think we'll see both in the years ahead. And I believe that in such a liminal space, this hinge moment of time, we are called to make a decision, each one of us. We can be an ordinary leader, and the Lord knows that's hard enough right now. And that may be what various people will say, that's if I could be a good ordinary leader, I'd be happy. But there are those among us and those who drink deeply from the reservoirs of hope, believing that God has got something yet unseen to us that is life-giving, beautiful, a new creation. And that's in front of us, and we have to keep walking toward it, even though we're not clear about it yet. And these people have got to be clear about their focus on purpose. Purpose, not only what do I think my purpose is, but this in the context in which I am living, of the we, not just the I. Where's God calling? And then who have the courage to just step out there when I think about it, sometimes it's foggy and you can't see maybe more than a flashlight's beam in front of you, and you keep walking anyway. That takes courage, and there will be failures and there will be loss, but that's the kind of resilient leadership that I think will lead us as congregations, as communities of faith, and as a nation and a world, into resilient leadership.
And inspiring, I think.